If the viral theory going around is true, then every dollar you earn, every tax you pay, every debt you'll ever carry was engineered 3 centuries ago by 4 men you've never heard of. And you're living in a system designed so you can never escape. A video with over 600,000 views claims 4 bankers across 300 years deliberately built an inescapable global debt trap. William Paterson in 1694, Nathan Rothschild in the 1800s, the Jekyll Island meeting in 1910, Paul Volcker in 1982. Here's what made me uncomfortable. Some of what they present is documented history, but other parts? They're mixing real events with conspiracy narratives in ways that are deeply problematic. So I spent 2 weeks reading the actual historical documents they cite. And what I found is way more interesting than it's all true or it's all false. In the next few minutes, I'm showing you what's real, what's interpretation, and why this matters more than you think. Stay with me. The theory goes like this. Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The US owes $38 trillion. The planet owes $315 trillion. But if everyone owes money, who are they paying? The viral narrative claims it's not random, it's engineered. 4 key moments, 4 key figures, each one building on the last to create a system where debt can never actually be repaid, where governments are trapped, where you're trapped, and where a small group profits from the whole thing. Now here's where it gets tricky. The historical events they mention, those happened. The Bank of England charter exists. The Jekyll Island meeting happened. The IMF restructuring is documented. But does that mean there's a multi-century conspiracy? That's what we're about to find out. And I need to warn you up front. Part of this investigation goes into uncomfortable territory. Because when you start naming specific banking families as architects of global control, especially Jewish banking families like the Rothschilds, you're walking into a narrative with a very dark history. We'll address that head on. Let's start at the beginning. 1694. William Paterson and the Bank of England. The claim? This charter made government debt permanent for the first time in history. Is that true? Here's what actually happened. England was broke. King William needed to finance a war with France. Traditional methods were exhausted. So William Paterson, a Scottish merchant, proposed something new. Create a bank that lends to the government in exchange for interest backed by tax revenue. The charter granted the bank the right to issue currency and lend to the government. Initial loan, £1.2 million at 8% interest. This is documented fact. You can read the charter. But here's the twist nobody mentions. Before this, monarchs borrowed from individual financiers and constantly defaulted. Credit markets were chaos. The Bank of England model provided stability. It wasn't created by an evil genius in a dark room. It emerged from decades of financial disaster as what people thought was a better solution. Now, did this create incentives toward ongoing debt? Yes. When you make borrowing easier, governments borrow more. That's economics, not conspiracy. Here's what the viral theory doesn't tell you. England died to pay down debt under this system. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain ran surpluses and reduced debt significantly over decades. So even with the Bank of England, debt reduction is possible. It's politically difficult, but it's not mathematically impossible. Mainstream financial historians like Charles Kindleberger, whose work is foundational in this field, concluded that central banking institutions evolved primarily to provide monetary stability and prevent panics. The debt aspect was a consequence, not the designed purpose. So, verdict on claim number 1. The Bank of England charter is real. It did systematize government borrowing. But calling it deliberate engineering of an inescapable trap? That's interpretation, not fact. This is where I need to be extremely careful and blunt. The viral theory claims Nathan Rothschild's bond market innovations made sovereign default mathematically impossible. When you start attributing global financial control to the Rothschild family specifically, you're entering dangerous territory. Here's why. For over a century, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have falsely blamed Jewish bankers for controlling world finance. This isn't ancient history. These theories fueled pogroms. They were central to Nazi propaganda. They continue today, leading to real violence against Jewish communities. So let's separate documented history from conspiracy. What's real? The Rothschild family built a successful international banking business in the early 1800s. Nathan Rothschild in London became heavily involved in government bond markets. He did profit during the Napoleonic Wars. This is acknowledged history. What's not real? That the Rothschilds made sovereign default mathematically impossible or engineered inescapable debt. Here's the evidence that destroys that claim. Throughout the 19th century, governments defaulted constantly despite Rothschild involvement. Argentina defaulted multiple times. Greece defaulted. The Ottoman Empire defaulted. Spain defaulted repeatedly. According to Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt's work analyzing 8 centuries of financial history, sovereign defaults happened regularly regardless of who the creditors were. The Rothschilds didn't prevent this because they couldn't. No banking family, no matter how successful, controlled the entire bond market. So why does the viral video make this claim? Because conspiracy narratives need villains. And unfortunately, anti-Semitic theories have long cast Jewish banking families in that role. Here's the test. If the argument works by just saying international bankers without naming specific Jewish families, ask yourself why the specific naming is necessary. Usually, it's because the argument is borrowing from anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, whether intentionally or not. The documented reality? Bond markets evolved over centuries through hundreds of institutions, government policies, and technological changes. Attributing it to one family's design is conspiracy theory, not history. And yes, there is a legitimate discussion about creditor power in bond markets. Large financial institutions do have influence. That's documented in mainstream research. But that's very different from claiming one banking family engineered a multi-century trap. Now we get to the secret meeting. 1910, Jekyll Island, the creation of the Federal Reserve. This one's interesting because, unlike some conspiracy theories, the meeting actually happened. So let's separate fact from fiction. What's documented? In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich invited banking experts to a secret meeting at Jekyll Island Resort off Georgia. Attendees included representatives from J.P. Morgan, National City Bank, and Cohn Loeb and Company. They met in secret to draft banking reform legislation. This is acknowledged historical fact. The Federal Reserve itself has exhibits about this meeting. Why the secrecy? Banking reform was politically toxic. After the severe panic of 1907, there was intense debate about preventing future crises. But there was also deep public suspicion of Wall Street, so they met privately. The meeting produced a draft that eventually became the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, all documented. But here's where conspiracy diverges from reality. The viral claim is that this meeting was designed to enable infinite government borrowing. Let me show you what the Federal Reserve Act actually says. The stated purposes were providing an elastic currency, establishing effective banking supervision, and preventing panics. The word government borrowing doesn't appear in the primary objectives. Now, the Fed was given authority to buy government securities, and over time, especially after 2008, the Fed's holdings of government debt grew dramatically. But was enabling infinite borrowing the designed purpose, or was it how the system evolved over a century? According to Alan Meltzer's comprehensive Federal Reserve history, the Jekyll Island participants were primarily focused on preventing banking panics. The U.S. had experienced major panics in 1873, 1893, and 1907. Each time, the lack of a central bank meant no lender of last resort. The Federal Reserve was modeled on European central banks, but with regional reserve banks instead of centralized control, reflecting American suspicion of centralized power. This was political compromise, not conspiracy. Here's what matters. There is legitimate criticism of how the Fed functions today, especially regarding deficit financing. Many economists across the political spectrum have concerns. These are valid policy debates. But saying the Fed increasingly facilitates government borrowing beyond sustainable levels is legitimate criticism. Saying the Fed was secretly designed in 1910 to enable infinite borrowing as part of a conspiracy is conspiracy theory. The difference? The first invites solutions. The second implies hidden control that can't be addressed democratically. One more thing. The viral video relies heavily on The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. I need to be direct. This book is not considered credible by mainstream historians or economists. It makes factual errors and interprets ambiguous events in the most conspiratorial light possible. Compare that to actual Federal Reserve historians like Meltzer or economic historians like Barry Eichengreen. Same documents, very different conclusions. They found that central banking evolved to solve real problems, with mistakes along the way, but not as deliberate conspiracy. Verdict? The Jekyll Island meeting happened. It was secret. It influenced the Fed's creation. But interpreting this as conspiracy to enable infinite borrowing ignores historical context and imposes motives not supported by evidence. The final pillar, Paul Volcker in the 1980s and IMF restructuring. The claim is this: trapped developing nations in eternal debt. This one's actually the most interesting because it touches on legitimate economic debates. Here's what happened. Late 1970s, many developing nations accumulated large dollar-denominated debt. When Paul Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979, he dramatically raised interest rates to fight U.S. inflation. This worked. Inflation fell from over 13% to under 4% by 1983. But it devastated indebted nations. Higher U.S. rates meant higher debt service costs. Mexico announced in August 1982 it couldn't pay. Brazil and Argentina faced similar crises. The IMF restructured this debt but attached harsh conditions. Structural adjustment programs required spending cuts, privatization, trade liberalization, and free market reforms. This is documented. And the criticism that these policies had severe social consequences is also well documented. Cuts to education and healthcare, increased poverty, political instability. Critics like Joseph Stiglitz argue these programs prioritized debt repayment to Western banks over human welfare. Development economists have published hundreds of papers on these problems. The IMF itself has acknowledged mistakes. But here's where legitimate criticism becomes conspiracy. The viral video frames this as Volcker deliberately engineering eternal debt as part of a multi-century plan. The more straightforward explanation? This was crisis management driven by multiple factors. U.S. domestic policy prioritizing inflation control. Concerns about global banking collapse if major nations defaulted. Ideological beliefs about free markets. And yes, protection of creditor interests. It was messy, often wrong-headed, had terrible human costs. But it wasn't a deliberate conspiracy to trap nations as part of a centuries-long plan. Key principle: don't attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by institutional incentives, ideology, and policy mistakes. So after investigating all four claims, what's my verdict? The viral narrative presents a clean arc, 4 figures across 3 centuries, each engineering the next step in an inescapable system. It's compelling. It has villains, a plot, and simple explanations for complex problems, but it's not supported by evidence. What the evidence shows is that our debt-based monetary system evolved messily over centuries, shaped by thousands of actors, countless policies, technological changes, wars, financial crises, and unintended consequences. It's complicated and frustrating, but it's not a conspiracy. Now here's what's really important. There are serious, legitimate concerns about the global debt system, and they deserve engagement without conspiracy theories. Global debt is over $315 trillion. That's real, documented by the Bank for International Settlements. Many economists worry it's unsustainable. The IMF has warned about vulnerabilities. These aren't secrets. They're in official reports. There are legitimate questions about whether debt-based fiat systems are optimal. Some economists advocate for alternatives, from full reserve banking to different monetary regimes. These are serious policy proposals. There are also real concerns about who benefits from high debt. Often it's large institutions holding bonds. Who bears the costs? Often ordinary taxpayers and vulnerable populations in developing countries. These are real issues. But when we frame these as multi-century conspiracies by banking families, we make it harder to address them. If the system is deliberately inescapable by hidden controllers, what can you do? But if you understand it as a system with flaws and misaligned incentives, you can advocate for reform. Here's your framework for evaluating these claims. Does the explanation require attributing perfect foresight and coordination across centuries to a small group? If so, it's probably conspiracy. Does it identify systemic incentives and institutional structures producing problematic outcomes? If so, it's probably legitimate criticism. Our monetary and debt systems do have serious problems. But those problems aren't the result of multi-generational conspiracy. They're policy choices, institutional incentives, political pressures, and governance challenges, and those we can address through democratic engagement and reform. So what should you actually do with this? First, be skeptical of simple explanations for complex phenomena. If someone says 4 people across 3 centuries engineered the entire global financial system, it's too simple. Second, engage with legitimate economic criticism without conspiracy thinking. Read actual economists who critique the system. Learn about alternatives. Support reforms you believe in. That's productive. Sharing conspiracy videos isn't. Third, be extremely wary of narratives blaming specific groups, especially historically marginalized ones like Jewish banking families, for systemic problems. These narratives have dark histories and cause real harm. Fourth, understand that inescapable is framing, not fact. Debt can be managed, reduced, restructured. It requires political will and difficult trade-offs, but it's possible. Countries have done it. The real challenges with global debt, monetary policy, and financial stability are serious enough without conspiracy theories. Let's engage with them based on evidence, economic analysis, and democratic values, not multi-century villain narratives that ultimately disempower us. If this analysis helped, let me know what other complex claims you want investigated. And if you're interested in legitimate economic criticism of current systems, I'll link credible economists and policy proposals in the description. This isn't financial advice. It's about historical accuracy and critical thinking. Do your own research from credible sources. Thanks for watching.